Y'all know that I am not a big bass guy, but even I have to admit that the Fatfreq Cross HBB Deuce is frankly a lot of fun. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and well, for the past couple of weeks, I've been living with the HBB Deuce. I've got this on loan from my friend Adrian, who has kind of been asking me to review this thing for a while, and I initially dragged my feet because I know Fatfreq, I've heard their IEMs at shows. They are a brand that makes kind of these bass cannon IEMs that are kind of fun one-trick ponies, I guess, but they are kind of expensive also, like usually $600. But the Deuce here, well, this one's just $240, and for that you get a dynamic driver set that, frankly, for the past couple of weeks, I've been having a lot of fun with, and that's what we're going to talk about. If you want to check out the Deuce, I'll of course have it linked in the description down below, but with that out of the way, we will go to the table and talk about the physical form factor in this. I don't have the packaging in the original box and all the accessories and stuff, because this is just a loaner, but I can tell you what I think about the build quality, the fit and comfort, and then we'll get into talking about the sound and how this compares with some other IEMs that are kind of like it, although I'll be honest, like there is not a lot on the market that is like the HBB Deuce. This thing's pretty unique. So let's get into it. In terms of build quality, right, let's just skip to it. Cable, right? This is a nylon braided cable that is, as you can see, very, very red. I kind of like the redness of it, although I will maybe just pull out a qualification here that this seems like something that might get dirty pretty easily. This exact copy has not gotten dirty. Adrian's taken good care of it, and I hope I've taken good care of it for him as well because it's on loan, but this is just the sort of thing I could see getting a little bit grungy over time because of the light coloring and the nylon braid of it all. But otherwise, I actually think it's a pretty nice little cable. It's a little bit on the lightweight side. Kind of reminds me of the same cable or a similar cable that came with the Soft Ears Volume S recently. But yeah, it's got nice and pliable. It rodeo wraps quite well. It's not stiff. Maybe some people will have some issues with microphonics because it is an all nylon braided cable. I personally didn't have issues with it, but I'm also not particularly sensitive to that kind of stuff. So your mileage may vary. Now, up here at the top, of course, you've got your standard preformed ear hooks, as well as a 2-pin connector, which I'll pull out, although as I'm doing that, I guess I'll mention it is a pretty tight 2-pin connector, and it's also a recessed 2-pin connector. So if you're looking to swap cables, make sure that you're swapping it with a cable that's going to have a little protrusion like this, because the IM shape is going to swallow up that protrusion and again fit it pretty stiff. I guess better stiff than not stiff, or better stiff than loose, right? You don't want your earpieces falling off. But I don't know, anything else for me to say about the cable? I will talk about this briefly. So this is something that also comes in the box from my understanding. This is a 15 ohm impedance adapter, or about 16 ohms is what I measured on my multimeter. But basically what this does, so this is a 4.4 mil connector, you plug that into here, and that just adds an extra 15, 16 ohms of impedance to the cable, which will change the sound. And we'll talk about what that does for the sound in a little bit, but the gist of it is that if you want a lot more bass, this thing already has a lot of bass. If you want a lot more bass, just throw this thing on there. And, you know, this is not my favorite solution, not super elegant, but it's as a fun thing to play around with. I think it's pretty cool that that's included in the box. But that will lead us to talking about the earpieces themselves. And I'll just start with aesthetically. I think there's some things about this that are actually kind of iconic looking, like the red cable with the red logos. And over here on the other side, I'll just show you, you've got Fatfreq logo on one side and the HBB logo on the other side. I think the red motif is actually kind of cool. The outer panels, the exact pattern that they've got on here, I think is a little bit on the boring side, a little bit dull side, but overall, like it's a nice kind of iconic look, and I think that it's simple and executed fairly well. Now the earpieces themselves, I want to talk about these. Okay, I've worn a number of Fatfreq IEMs at audio shows before, and one thing that I've noticed is that they're pretty aggressive with their semi-custom molding. In fact, some of their IEMs fit me okay, and then some of their other IEMs like really just did not fit in my ear very well. So I was a little bit apprehensive about this particular build, and what I'll say is that this one actually fits me pretty well. As you can see, like the back wing on this thing is pretty aggressive, and all of the semi-custom molding here is fairly fairly opinionated, okay? So if your particular ear is not the same shape as mine, there's a possibility that this will be a little bit uncomfortable for you. What's kind of going in its favor is it is actually on the small side. I don't know how much of that is going to come across here as you see it, but this is a fairly compact IM, even though it does have 2 dynamic drivers in there. The one thing that is not super compact, and this is something I need to start doing more in my videos, so I'm gonna try and make this a point to do, is to measure the nozzle. All right, so let's pull off the ear tip of one of these IMs, pull out my calipers, and we're gonna measure the nozzle on this. And I'll just warn you right now, the nozzle it's pretty large, it's pretty chonkers, right? So you see here, it's about 6.7 millimeters. That is at the widest point. You can see that it has a pretty big lip on it that holds the ear tips on quite well. So the ear tips are going to be super secure, but the downside is just that is a chonker of a nozzle. Now, what I'll say is that it wasn't a problem for me. I didn't have any issues. In fact, I didn't even notice that it was a particularly wide nozzle until I broke out the calipers just a minute ago and measured it for myself beforehand. So your mileage may vary on whether or not that is an issue. What I'll say is that this nozzle just doesn't fit particularly deep into the ear. You can see I'm using like SpinFit CP100s, which for me kind of extend the fit. So I was looking for a slightly deeper fit than what these things give out of the box, which I think is probably why that wider nozzle didn't bother me. Now, is it going to bother you? Again, everyone's ears are slightly different, so it's going to be a hard thing for me to predict. But my suspicion is that I haven't heard people talking about the nozzle on this thing being a problem, so I don't get the impression that it is a problem for many people. But your mileage may vary. Anything else? Okay, I should actually show you what this thing looks like in my ear. As I'm talking about fit, what am I doing? Let me throw this in my ear and give you a look at what it looks like. So there, like I mentioned, it's actually surprisingly on the flat side. Like it's pretty narrow, and that gives it like this really nice flush fit. If you're looking for an IM to sleep with, I don't know that this is the sound signature I personally would sleep with, but if you are looking for an IM to sleep with, certainly this is one that fits in a way that could. You can see that shell size wise, it actually looks like it might even be kind of like medium large size, but really in my ear it feels squarely medium. I think that the semi-custom molding is doing pretty well in my ear. So yeah, I don't know. This doesn't feel particularly large, doesn't feel small, it feels pretty nice and secure. The only thing that I maybe would say is that because it is a little bit on the flat side, I think this cable is coming into contact with this part of my ear and preventing sometimes like this back part from fitting under my little concha wing 100% secure. Again, like it's not falling out of my ear. Like the stability is perfectly fine. But that one aspect of it does feel like maybe it is suffering from being somewhat of a narrow IM. But the plus side is, again, that it's a very flush fit, and I like that. So generally, actually pretty happy with the build quality, the form factor on this IM. So I guess that's going to lead us into talking about the sound signature on the HBB Deuce, and I've kind of already talked about it leading up to this. This is a bassy IM, but exactly how bassy are we talking? Well, we're talking that bassy. And well, that's a lot of bass, and this is without the impedance adapter, all right? So this graph is up on Squig if you want to check it out for yourself and compare it with some other IMs, but we'll talk about it right now, do a little bit of analysis together. So let's maybe try to ignore the bass for a second and just look at the frequency response from, let's say, 200 hertz and above. What you might notice is that this is very closely following the Harman target, all right? You've got kind of like this lean lower mid-range, this little tuck in the lower mid-range, which lets you have bass and still have like a contrasty sound, so it prevents muddiness in the bass. But then otherwise, you've got a fairly well-tuned set that is a little bit bright here in kind of the lower treble, upper vocal region, like the presence region. So that does add a little bit of like an edginess to the vocal content. But it also gives it that contrast that helps balance out against the bass. And then the treble, this just looks kind of like your traditional dynamic driver treble, which is, to my ear, like it's pretty decent. It's a little bit on the sharp side. I guess we'll talk a little bit more about my impressions, but more just to say that this is tuned very much Harman from about 200 hertz and above. Where it deviates from Harman, or where at least it takes its own opinionated direction, is here in the bass, where that is a mega bass boost. You can see this lighter dotted line. That's like the normal Harman target bass boost, which is already a bass boosted sound signature. Here with the HBB Deuce, like versus my neutral target, it's about 12 dB of bass above neutral for me. And that's a lot. Yeah, so it is very much a bassy set, but what you might notice too is that it is mostly like a sub-bassy set because you have this tuck down here. It doesn't give it like this bloated, mid-bassy, kind of mid-range swallowing sound. You still have a pretty contrasty, in fact, I would dare say like a V-shaped sound signature, right? You've got this excessive bass, you've got this excessive lower treble, and it gives it just kind of like this contrasty, exciting, not a warm bassy sound. It is contrasty and an exciting bassy sound. So that's basically the frequency response in a nutshell. But how does it actually sound to my ear? Well, let's talk about that stuff. So the bass is obviously, clearly a dominant feature of the sound signature here. But it doesn't mask everything else. That contrastiness that I was describing does a good job of preventing the bass from sounding overly muddy or bloated or any of those kind of negative words that you could get with a lot of bass with a lot of other IEMs, okay? Frankly, it is too much bass for my personal taste. So if I'm looking for like my one IEM that I'm gonna go after, it's not gonna be this, but it is a pretty fun one-trick pony when I'm in the mood for it, right? With some music, like I was listening to Tupac because HBB, right? It was really just satisfying hard hits with the bass. The Ambitions as a Writer song, like just a lot of fun on this set, absolutely. But when listening to some other music, maybe my more traditional music, Cigarettes After Sex, they probably have a little bit too much bass guitar in the mix of their music. And when I listen to it on this, it does come across a little bit on the droning side. Thunderous, yes, and kind of satisfying in a way. But it does get to the point where it is a little bit droning. And so it's just kind of maybe a double-edged sword with the bass that they've got here. It's very fun when it works, but with certain music, depending on how it's tuned and how it's mixed, it might end up being a little bit overbearing. But I think that's frankly kind of the point with this IEM. Again, it's a little bit of a one-trick pony, and I think it's that on purpose. That lower mid tuck that I mentioned means that some music also might not actually sound that bassy. So the Cure's Disintegration album is one that I use a lot of the times to test for that balance between sub bass and mid bass, because I don't think there's a lot of sub bass content in that album. And when I listen to it on this set, like I do get still like the contrasty staginess, but it doesn't actually sound that bass boosted because I think just a lot of the bass content is more in that upper bass region, whereas this set has that tuck that makes that bass much more sub-bass focused. Now, talking about something other than the bass, the vocals on this thing, like I mentioned, they have kind of that a little bit of excessive emphasis in the upper mid-range presence region, but it gives it that contrastiness that prevents the vocals from being pushed underwater and sounding muddy. They still come across nice and clean and clear. There's a lot of definitely a sense of clarity, I think you could describe here on the HBB Deuce. And it doesn't do it, I don't think it overdoes it, right? It is maybe a little bit on the overcooked side if I'm just judging purely like the tonality and the timbre, right? This is not a set that I would get for a rich, lush vocal experience or anything like that. But if you just want to make sure that things are coming through crispy and clear, it absolutely does here on the HBB Deuce. It can get maybe a little bit sibilant with certain tracks. Like it's not introducing sibilance to tracks that I don't expect it in, but in tracks where I do sometimes expect certain sets to bring out a little bit of sibilance, the HBB Deuce can bring out a little bit of that. And again, I think that, you know, for like tonal balance, the timbre and micro contrast details, that's not really where this thing deals or excels, but I do think that if you're going to have that much bass, the vocal tuning that you have on here is just about what you kind of need. Apart from those tonal characteristics too, like just to describe like the soundstage impressions of this set, the contrast here really does give it a very wide presenting head stage. Like the imaging is exaggerated, the bass gives it this really exaggerated sense of depth. It almost feels like kind of like a blown out Dolby Atmos mix. Again, not the most natural sounding sound signature, but when you're looking for this kind of fun, like it really is a lot of fun and pretty satisfying to listen to. It can be maybe a little bit exhausting would be the biggest criticism I have of this tonality, right? Again, this is certainly not my normal MO when I'm looking for an ideal sound signature, But if I'm looking for something fun to put on every once in a while for like 30 minutes, 60 minutes at a time, or looking for something to like put, show to somebody that's visiting my house, like, hey, check this out. This thing is, it's kind of special. It's kind of special. All right, so let me bring in a couple of other IEMs for comparison. They might not be the most obvious comparisons because frankly, there's just not a lot of obvious comparisons to the Deuce. I mean, maybe if I had some of like the Fatfreq Maestro Mini or something like that would be an interesting comparison, because that one costs like triple the price and I feel like it sounds pretty similar, but I haven't heard it for a while. But instead, we're gonna talk about this one. This is the Sennheiser IE300. This is another dynamic driver set, priced kind of similar to the Deuce. In fact, I think when this came out it was $300. And it's also like a bassy IEM, right? So this is a bassy dynamic driver, similar price. And I feel like this is a good comparison to see how well the Deuce is doing the signature, because this thing, the IE300 is not as bassy, and yet it still sounds muddier and thicker and soupier. Like that contrastiness that you get here with the Deuce, you really don't get. Like vocals sound underwater to me on the IE300. The bass doesn't have that tactility and snap on it. It just kind of has this soft attack on it that's just not that satisfying. And then you do get a little bit of upper treble zing on the IE300, which does help with some of the clarity and texturing, but frankly overall, I think the Deuce is just a much better execution of a very bassy dynamic driver sound at this price range. Another one I want to pull in, and this is again another one that doesn't entirely make sense for comparison because the price gap is so big, but this is the High Senior Megafest Bass Plus Edition, aka the Megabass. Price on this thing is like almost $600. I think it's $590, and this is also a very bass boosted IEM. But this thing is just, this thing sounds like it has a reason for being, whereas this bass is just like kind of unwanted. It's like too much bass. It's not especially good bass. It's not snappy. It's not satisfying, and it does intrude on the mid range. Whereas the bass on this one, it's isolated. It's contained, but then it's just kind of raw and engaging to listen to, whereas this guy's just, this is fine. This is actually probably the better balanced IEM. And if I was looking for one IEM only to ever have, neither of these would be my pick, but maybe I would go for the Megabass because I think the mid-range tonality on it is better. But the bass is really just kind of unwelcome here, whereas here with the Deuce, it's the reason that this IEM exists, and it is frankly a lot of fun. I forgot to show you what this thing squigs like with the impedance adapter, just to kind of show you how ridiculous the bass levels can get here on the Deuce, right? So this graph is without the impedance adapter, and then you add that 15 ohms of impedance, and you get like an extra 5 dB of bass boost, which when you're already talking this much bass, 5 dB might not sound like that much. It's a lot. It takes it to levels that are probably stupid, but again, with the right music and the right mood, it's kind of fun. It is not the way I would mostly listen to this IEM, but I think that is going to do it for my thoughts here on the HBB Deuce. Out of 5 stars, like this is an interesting one for me to review because like I've mentioned multiple times, this is not my usual favorite sound signature. I'm not usually looking for a bassy IEM. And if I was looking for one IEM to have for myself and to recommend for everybody else, frankly, it would not be the Deuce. But I already have a lot of IEMs that are like what I like. And if I'm looking for something to add to my library that's a lot of fun in a unique way and something that like is exciting to share with other people, it's like, hey, check this thing out. A little bit of a one-trick pony, but frankly, pretty fun. The Deuce is that. And for that, I'm going to give this thing a solid 4 stars. If you want to check it out, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, also linked in the description down below. And I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the pitch.